Welcome to Collab Conversations. This episode's guest, Bob Bick, has been tirelessly advocating for a better patient experience through his work with Kidney Cancer Canada and Cancertity. He is also a recognized figure in the Canadian oncology community and has been instrumental in the dialogue on oncology relevant endpoints. Hi, Bob. As you know from the discussions we've had, that I think this is a very interesting area of work. I'm looking forward to learning more from you. But before we dive into that discussion, can you tell us briefly about the path that led you to the work you're doing today?
Well, sure. As you're aware, I'm the co-lead of the Cancertity Coalition, which is a coalition of about 30 different oncology-focused patient groups from across Canada. And our work has primarily been to try to influence policy as it affects access to treatments for cancer. And that policy is, focused on both reimbursement policy at the provincial and drug program level, as well as at the health technology assessment level through our HTA organizations like INES and the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technology and Health. So, we've been doing a lot of work in different policy areas over the years. But about 2 or so years ago, I was contacted by one of what I would refer to as a friend of Cancertity, an oncologist from Brampton by the name of Dr. Henry Conter. Dr. Henry Conter is kind of well known also in the oncology community across Canada because he sat on the the expert review committee for cancer drugs with the Canadian Organization for Drug Technology and Health, and he has lots of other roles, but primarily he treats patients. He contacted me because he's worked with Cancertity and Kidney Cancer Canada in the past on numerous policy issues, and asked me if I was actually aware of the enormous pipeline of drugs, of clinical trials for cancer drugs that are utilizing surrogate endpoints as opposed to the primary endpoints that we're familiar with, like overall survival and health-related quality of life, and of course more recently progression-free survival. I admitted to him that I wasn't that aware of this particular issue, and he encouraged me to do a deep dive in it, and he was very interested in supporting us, and I did, and I was quite surprised to find out that the pipeline of clinical trials for cancer drugs is massively tilted towards the use of these what we call surrogate endpoints. And just for clarity, in clinical trials, a surrogate endpoint is a measure of effect of a specific treatment that may correlate with a real clinical endpoint, but does not necessarily have a guaranteed relationship. So, and there's a lot of, the one that we're very familiar with is obviously disease-free survival. We've seen that pop up a little bit in our community, but we've also seen, PCR, is popped up, and there's about 20. Sure. So, an endpoint is a clinical measure, that basically demonstrates efficacy and safety of an actual treatment, and it's used, to guide treatment making decisions both at the health technology assessment level, but also at the clinical level as well. The ones that we're most, the gold standard is obviously overall survival. It's the primary endpoint. Its utility is constrained, though, however, by certain disadvantages. The biggest one being the time-consuming nature of trials using overall survival, which can actually, lead to a lot of decision making about to actually not study a certain drug in a certain indication, particularly in the early stage. And that's where most of our focus is, by the way, in the early stage, in the adjuvant and early stage treatment of a disease. So, overall survival, which rightfully is the gold standard, right? I mean, the most important thing for patients is that a treatment is going to lead to a longer life, and then obviously the next one is a higher quality of life. Those are very important, but they take a long time to determine in clinical trials. So there's now a push to find other surrogate clinical endpoints in lieu of overall survival, to condense that time from the discovery at the bench to availability at the pharmacy, and that's critical. Of course, it comes with uncertainty, and that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit in our discussion.
Yeah, so I mean, let's start right away. Let's talk about uncertainty because it seems like our health technology assessment, our HTA, isn't necessarily keen or open to using these other relevant endpoints in oncology, or surrogate endpoints, as you call them. So let's talk about the uncertainty.
Well, so I mean, first of all, the experience so far has been mixed, but they haven't been dealing with what we call the avalanche yet, right? I mean, there's been a lot of trials or a lot of submissions where they have had dealt with some of the more familiar ones. Like I said, disease-free survival has been one of the more common ones, and I was very much involved with a technology review for pembrolizumab for the adjuvant treatment of renal cell carcinoma, which got a positive recommendation. But that's not, that's not really the worry, right? I mean, there's been mixed so far with the limited number of submissions that have gone through using surrogate endpoints as the primary endpoint. There's been mixed results. The ones that we're concerned about, of course, is where they've said we don't really understand the value of this endpoint, and basically, as you know, in your experience and a lot of our patient groups that we work with, is the reflexive nature of health technology assessment producers when dealing with uncertainty is to say, come back later with more evidence. We have now seen the emergence of these new small pilot projects that are meant to deal with uncertainty, like time limited recommendations, and coverage with evidence development recommendations, but they're very limited right now, and they're not necessarily focused on this particular issue of these new emerging endpoints, which I'll often refer to, by the way, as oncology relevant endpoints, because they're very specifically designed for different tumor sites in oncology. So, what we're seeing right now, though, is that a lot of these endpoints are being accepted by the regulators, right? Like in the US, the FDA, and in Canada, Health Canada are saying, hey, we believe that these surrogate endpoints are generating significant evidence to convince us that we should license these drugs. But as you pointed out, at the health technology assessment level is where this bridge falls apart. And that's where CanCertainty has decided that we need to focus on this issue. And it's not, I want to be clear, it's not to advocate or convince or lobby governments and HTA producers that they need to accept these absolutely and trust them. It's to actually get them to work on this right now, to develop the methodologies and the review techniques that are required to properly understand these surrogate endpoints. We want the work to start now, because I think you'll probably recall the work that we encountered using progression-free survival going back, a decade or so. Progression-free survival was then considered to be a surrogate endpoint. Now it's a traditional endpoint, but it took a long time for our HTA producers in Canada and our payers in Canada to accept it as an appropriate and surrogate. I mean, a lot of work had to go forward to correlate the value of it along with the overall survival, and that took a number of years. Um, we certainly don't want to see the same lengthy, drawn-out process for many of these other surrogate endpoints. We need to condense it so that these promising new therapies that are being developed, these novel treatments that have tremendous promise for patients, aren't delayed longer. And so we want to see a lot of work that concurrent work. First of all, on reimbursement policy, like having more thought and programs designed to deal with uncertainty in a risk sharing type concept. If there is a higher degree of uncertainty, don't just say no. Say, let's find a way of making this available to patients on a time limited basis. Expand these current pilots that we have, but also let's figure out how to assess these surrogate endpoints on a disease by disease basis, because some surrogates are very valuable in certain treatment settings and perhaps not in others, in other cancer types. So, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And also, the opportunity to use real world evidence to demonstrate the value of these surrogate endpoints is remarkable. And as you know, in Canada, there's been a fair bit of work in the last number of years to understand the value of real world evidence and how it can inform reimbursement decision making and how it can inform health technology assessment. So a lot of these policy areas are intermeshed with each other. But the reason CanCertainty is involved with this is to basically put pressure on all stakeholders to move forward as rapidly as possible, because the storm is coming. It's right. It's already, the rains are already happening. We're already seeing a lot of the clinical trials that are using surrogate endpoints, result now in submissions. And we're seeing a mix right now. We're seeing health technology assessment producers are saying, wow, we've never seen this before. We don't know what it means. We don't know how to deal with it. Well, that's the point. You have to start allocating resources and figuring out methodologies and how to work with stakeholders, how to work with real world evidence. That's the work that we're doing right now. And it's like I said, it's not just saying accept them and move on. It's like, no, like we all have to figure it out. So that's the main idea behind the work of CanCertainty.
So you said, Bob, that there's like a lot of clinical trials that are now using these oncology relevant endpoints beyond overall survival. And as you and I both know, and like a lot of we're fully aware that a lot of these clinical trials are designed outside of Canada. So are there other jurisdictions that are already looking at these oncology relevant endpoints, and like within their HTA, are they starting to move in that direction where they are evaluating these other oncology relevant endpoints?
Excellent question. One of the jurisdictions that seems to be taking a bit of a leadership role in this is the UK. So NICE is now just a few months ago started working with a group of organizations who make recommendations for the use of new drugs to develop more guidance on the use of surrogate outcomes when there's been a cost-effective analysis involved in these approval processes. So there is an international working group, and and CADIT recently has recently joined it as well. I mean, the good news is that Canada is part of that working group, along with, I can't remember all of them, but Australia is involved with it. I think France is involved with it. So there is a working group. So there has been some recognition, some of it perhaps as a result of some advocacy from different stakeholders, whether it be industry or clinicians or patients, but they are starting to recognize, also that the storm is coming. And, like I said, I think, the opportunity for patient groups here is to continue to apply these pressures, because there is a lot of tremendous, opportunity here for patients. Some of it might not pan out, but I mean, we don't want to lose the potential right here, right? We want to I think patients want to be at the cutting edge of technology, and I think it is the obligation of particularly wealthier countries like Canada and the U.S. and France and Germany to take leadership in these areas to ensure some of these promising new therapies are given a fair shot in the patient population, and to assess them over time. And I think that's the real challenge, right? And so right now, but also part of the challenge is, and I think this is part of why we're talking today, is to also inform other stakeholders about this, right? It's not just to to get our payers and our health technology assessment producers urgently working on this issue and figuring out new methodologies and methods to work with these new endpoints, but also to prepare our patient groups, especially those patient groups that actively participate in health technology assessment. They're going to have to figure out a whole new, it was a lot of work for patient groups to understand the value of progression-free survival. We have at least between 25 and 50 emerging endpoints right now that are going to be quite complex for patient groups to understand, and then let alone patient groups going down to the patient level. I think there's a huge challenge there. What are patient relevant endpoints? How can we also describe this to them? It's one thing. Overall survival, I think, is a pretty basic concept, right? I mean, this drug has got evidence that it's going to extend the life of, X percentage of patients who use this treatment. Then it's sort of like the patient can understand that, saying this has got a good chance of actually helping me live longer. But, what does, event-free survival actually mean to me? So patient groups are going to have a number of concurrent challenges. One, of course, is to understand this whole new emerging area of oncology relevant endpoints, particularly in your own therapeutic area. The bigger ones, by the way, the ones that are going to deal with it the most are going to be lung cancer, prostate, and breast cancer, are we're seeing a lot of this. But like I said, kidney cancer, we've already done a submission, and everyone eventually is going to be dealing with this, like everyone. But we're also going to have to come up with education methods for our own patient population to, and as you know, that's the all of our patient groups have a mandate to educate and support as well as advocate for access to treatments, and therein lies a huge challenge. And CanCertainty intends to really help equip patient groups to be able to deliver this education to patients so they understand, what these surrogate endpoints actually mean to them as patients and what the value might be to them.
Yeah. So you talked about, you said there are 25 emerging endpoints that you're looking at. Can you talk to us a little bit? I mean, you talked a little bit about progression-free survival, but there are other endpoints that you see in the work that you're doing that are going to be really important, not only in the HTA process, but like that are going to be important to educate the patient advocates and the patients.
So first of all, I mean, so I'll run through a couple of the ones that we're seeing a lot right now. So beyond overall survival and health-related quality of life and progression-free survival, the ones that we're familiar with, we're starting to see, surrogate endpoints like complete response or disease-free survival, or event-free survival, or invasive disease-free survival, or metastasis-free survival, or major pathological response, overall response rate. The list goes on. I mean, pathological complete response is a big one that we're seeing right now, particularly in breast. So I'm not going to go into actually providing definitions of them all because there's a lot of nuance in them. And if people want to actually see active, descriptions of what they actually mean in the context of a specific treatment, the best place to go is clinicaltrials.gov, and look up the actual treatment, the actual clinical trial for the treatment, because sometimes even for something like disease-free survival, the definition might change a little bit from trial to trial, usually because of the type of tumor type, right? So, but I mean, and therein lies a bit of a challenge, right? To develop a comprehensive dictionary, which I hope to work on as well over the course of the next year or so,
Yeah.
is a reference
I was
dictionary
going
for
to ask,
this.
is that going to be something CanCertainty is going to be working on, like a
Yeah,
dictionary?
I've started to develop a bit of a document around this already, but it's a little bit complicated in the sense that, like I said, sometimes they're not a static definition because sometimes it changes from tumor to tumor. So this is multidimensional. But there's often sort of a common definition, which we're going to, so that in itself will be helpful to patient groups to equip them with the basic definition and also some reference materials about, how it's used in clinical trials. But like I said, there's about 20, like IQVIA did a study. IQVIA International did a study to identify all these emergent endpoints, and that they identified over 50, but they identified 25 of which they're seeing with a fair bit of frequency. And so that's kind of what we're focusing on right now is the more frequent ones. But I'm sure there's going to be a higher frequency of the next tier as well over time. So it's going to be a challenge. We're used to like 3 endpoints in our world, and now
Yeah.
we might be dealing with like between 40 and 50 of them commonly in the next few years. So it's a policy area. It's an area of huge educational need, and I have to also do the caveat. I'm not even an expert on this. I mean, I understand the challenges. I understand the need to learn, but I'm still on the learning curve. And when it comes to methodologies, I mean, I'm not a health economist. I'm not an epidemiologist. I mean, I can only understand at a certain level. It's a bit deeper than lay level, but it's not absolutely down at the level of clinical or a health economist level. I mean, that strata in between. And I believe that there's going to be a need to bring a lot of people, at least to my level of understanding.
Yeah. So we Well, you talked at the beginning about time to patient access, and like it has come up a little bit in our conversation. And when we think about time to patient access and overall survival benefit, you said, like how OS takes a lot of time to it takes a lot of time for that data to mature and to have that information. So how are these other endpoints helping us to reduce that time to patient access?
Well, it's kind of a mixed bag there. So certainly on the clinical trial side. So most of the time when we're talking about time to patient, we're talking about the time from licensing to patient availability. That's that the policy area of time to patient for the patient groups that you and I work with. You're now including the time from bench science to patients. So that's a slightly different issue. What with the issues around the use of surrogate endpoints, that's to really compress the clinical trial timeline, which if they didn't use these, a lot of clinical trials would likely not be feasible if they didn't move to surrogate endpoints to condense the timeline, because clinical trials are massively expensive. So when you have to engage, multiple clinicians in multiple sites around the globe, often in the hundreds, and, along with the other, dimension of time. I mean, if you have to seek overall survival, the cost for a clinical trial that may not actually be successful would be cost prohibitive. So the rationale for using surrogate endpoints, it's not exclusively, but one of the significant rationales is to actually make the clinical trials feasible, so that we can actually assess some promising new agents, and with using different endpoints that could be good surrogates for overall survival. But time will tell. Like those surrogates definitely have to be validated, but they can be validated in the real world using real world evidence. And that's so the opportunity here is not necessarily to condense the timeline, the time to patient timeline that we're familiar with from registry, from licensing to availability, is to actually improve the opportunity for promising new agents to be available.
So then, like, how are pharmaceutical companies looking at these oncology relevant endpoints? I mean, obviously, they're the ones who are conducting, in most cases, the clinical trials. So are they looking at oncology relevant endpoints as like maybe a new innovation in clinical trial design?
Well, I mean, I think it's beyond a new innovation. I think it's well established now, because we're now seeing clinical trials actually conclude, with evidence based on the use of these surrogate endpoints.
On these.
So, I mean, so this, of course, is the great disconnect, right? Is the people who design clinical trials uh, aren't necessarily well connected with the people in pharmaceutical companies that are dealing with market access, or the medical relations with clinicians. There is definitely a bit of a disconnect here. And that's partially also what we're trying to do, right? Is to actually get a little bit more of a common umbrella, so that people understand what's happening earlier in development, so that they can plan for these later stages of drug submissions and regulatory approval and health technology assessment. Even in the industry, people that I work with, some of them have about the same amount of knowledge as you and I about these things. They're also kind of saying, "Wow, we have to get caught up on this, because next year we have a drug submission using one of these endpoints, and we don't even really know what it means yet." Right? And that's kind of that I mean, I'm sure they'll rapidly catch up because they have the resources. Unlike patient groups, pharmaceutical companies have a lot of resources for policy and clinical and HTA and health economics. They'll be able to do this and move quite quickly to to direct their internal resource to address a clinical trial that's coming forward, ready for a drug submission. So I have full confidence they'll get ready for it. But I mean, they also have to change the way they do their drug submissions. They also
Mhm.
have a responsibility here, Sabrina, to work with patient groups to tell us well in advance. I think. I mean, you've seen this a ton of times, right? It's like, give us lots of advance notice of a drug submission period, but when it's got something unique involved with it, we're going to need some training. We're going to need some briefing. We're going to need some orientation. We're going to need the flow of policy materials on this. Like we need to collaborate in an ethical way, obviously. But you know, patient groups don't have those kind of resources. We're
Yeah.
often kitchen table organizations, or especially the smaller cancer groups. Like the smaller disease areas like kidney cancer or pancreatic cancer. I mean, there's small organizations to wrap their heads around this policy area is going to be a challenge, and we need support from pharma companies.
Yeah, it's interesting that you would say that, and because I was thinking as you were talking about that, how HTA is going to be involved. So how are Cardiff and Ines going to be involved in educating the patient groups? I mean, I know they don't do that very well, but like, what is their role? Have you been in discussions with them with the work that you're doing now on how you're going to educate or disseminate this information, or how is this going to move forward?
Well, that's part of the work that Cancer has been doing. So, our first major event around this was last year at the Canadian Association of Population Therapeutics here in Toronto. It was October last year, exactly a year ago. And we ran a breakfast session that was basically meant to identify the policy challenges that are related to these emerging endpoints. So we invited a range of stakeholders from all the communities you would expect, right? The patient community, clinicians, manufacturers, as well as payers and HTA producers. So we actually made a specific effort to involve the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technology and Health in that particular session, and we ran sort of what was called we ran a condensed Delphi session there, which was we had experts presenting on this, including Dr. Christian Thorland, who's an internationally renowned health economist and a methodologist in this particular area, and you know we did some presentations around the challenges and the issues and the statistics, like how many trials are actually emerging that are using these, sometimes at the exclusion of overall survival. I mean, you
Hmm.
mentioned earlier, in addition, but sometimes they're at the exclusion of, overall survival isn't even powering some of these clinical trials. Anyways, we had a tremendous session that came up with a pile of recommendations of what we need to do to prepare the Canadian, environment for this. What was a really interesting outcome is that we were approached by Cadith immediately afterwards to do what I would call a command performance. They asked us to present to staff. So we basically did a condensed version of that whole session virtually in December of last year, where we brought together the same group of experts, the same experts from IQVIA and everything else, and did a presentation to about I think it was between 15 and 20 CAD staff, the people that are actually involved in the reviews, to give them a sense of the developments in this policy area and the urgency required to start to internally develop this. And there's been engagement since then with them. I can't say we've had the same engagement with Ines, but that's part of my own lack of French capabilities as well. But Kath and Ines work very closely on some of these policy areas, anyways. So I think Kath has started to recognize the challenges. Subsequent to that, CanCertainty hosted an advisory board of Canadian experts to sort of map out the pathway over the next year or two about how to supercharge this policy area, like how to get a high degree of focus and activity and a recognition of its importance. CADIS participated in that as well. So there has been I think some positive indications from that agency that they're taking this quite seriously.
Yeah, I mean that's always good news to hear. I actually was at that Canadian Association Population Therapeutics conference. I missed the breakfast session, but the you had the panel discussion afterwards, which was, I think, probably my favorite panel of the whole conference. So great job on that. And then again at the CADIS conference, another presentation that, again, you're like bringing these conversations to the forefront, and it's really important that we start having these conversations, especially with the stakeholders who are going to be a little bit more hesitant to bring them into play. But
Yeah, I mean, the objective here is to actually not wait until it's piling on top of us, but to actually start dealing with it in advance. So yeah, you're
Yeah, be
absolutely. We also did
proactive.
at the CAS symposium. We did a presentation. We kind of had a bit of a traveling road show. So I took these experts on the road. We did the ISPOR conference in Boston. We did a presentation to the Innovative Medicines Canada, to that oncology working group team there. So all to sort of like also because we think all stakeholders need to have a high degree of focus on there, as well as a high degree of collaboration. And so yeah, we've been traveling around a fair bit and trying to get a high degree of focus on this policy area, because I think my worry is that there's going to be, if we don't deal with this properly, promising new therapies will never get to the patient.
Yeah, I agree. So you talked about that breakfast session that unfortunately I missed, but you talked about some of the policy challenges. Can you tell us maybe like some of the high level policy challenges that you Cancer Certainty will be looking at very closely?
Sure. I think one of the areas, of course, is resolving the uncertainty, right? So how do we resolve the uncertainty? There's the potential use, well, not the potential, the absolute requirement to use real world evidence to actually address the uncertainties that are inherent in the use of some of these endpoints. And the good news is that um, INES and CADITH have had have done a lot of work in how what is the decision grade evidence and the appropriate methodologies work can be applied to this topic area. I mean, there's going to have to be some changes, obviously, because the next area, of course, is the methodologies that are going to be required to assess all these evolving endpoints. They're not going to be the same, obviously, as overall survival
Mhm.
or health-related quality of life. There's going to be a whole realm of validation techniques, of which I am not at all an expert to speak to. So don't ask me any questions about validation techniques.
I
Uh,
promise.
but there's the methodology issue is going to be critical on this one. And it's not going to, they can't just do it. That's why there's a bit of I like the promising nature of the international collaboration that NICE is leading, right? Because there is definitely going to be a lot of focus on methodology. This obviously cannot happen in a silo. This has to include a lot of other experts, both from industry, but also from academia, and even patient groups and clinician groups should be participant in the how methodologies are going to evolve in this particular area. So that's one of the challenges area. But we also, one of the bigger challenges, and that's the one that I'm trying to work on right now in this discussion with you, is the education issue, right? Is just to prepare stakeholder
Hmm.
groups on this topic area. Start them off slow, just with like, what are surrogate endpoints? What, how often we're going to see them in the future? And the answer is a lot. So there's the education challenge, right? So it's like we have to start preparing all stakeholders for this new area. So like I said, so there's methodologies, there's education, there's collaboration. Those are sort of the areas that we identified as being major areas requiring a lot of focus and work going forward over the next year or two.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is going to be such fascinating work, and I can't wait to see and to be involved in what is coming out of what you're doing. But just to circle back a little bit, because we talked about, overall survival, and obviously patients are looking to have overall survival, but, they're not always looking to have overall survival because sometimes, fewer side effects are more important or better symptom control could be more important to them than overall survival. So how do these oncology relevant endpoints like within that patient preference conversation, the patient value dialogue, how do these relevant or surrogate endpoints play into that conversation?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, these endpoints need to be validated. And that is, because it's a surrogate for either health-related quality of life or overall survival, eventually we have to ensure that, that in a particular disease setting, that this is actually proven out, right? And there, and one of the experts that I work with, Dr. Christian Thorland, believes that it would only take about 18 months to validate a lot of these outcome measures in the real world. Now, I'm not saying that everyone's going to agree with that particular assessment, but he believes that, and you won't necessarily in those 18 months achieve the same confidence level as you would with with an existing marker like overall survival. But he said you'd come very close. And of course, over time, those therapies would be, the longer it's studied in the real world, the more validated it will become. But
Hmm.
I think what we have to do is we have to get the confidence with evolving methodologies and expert opinion that suggests that there's a strong correlation between overall survival and that surrogate outcome. My experience directly is in, like I said, in metastatic renal cell carcinoma. Uh, Pembrolizumab, was recently approved across Canada, except for Quebec. It's still a pending approval in Quebec, health technology assessment. But it was approved based on disease-free survival. Now, what's there's a bit of a challenge there. Like, listen, I'm not saying this is like everyone should say, wow, this is great, give it to me. I mean, I know the clinicians that I work with are sort of saying not all the clinicians are believing that adjuvant pembro is completely ready for prime time right now. They believe that disease-free survival, there's strong indication, that it's correlated to overall survival, but it's not absolutely proven yet. But I mean, there are going to be patients that say, let me try it. I'm young, I'm otherwise, and relatively healthy. There's some side effects involved with some of these agents, but I think the benefits outweigh the risks. Give it to me. So there's going to be a lot of those patients who are going to provide the evidence base to demonstrate, to actually correlate that disease-free survival to overall survival. That's extremely valuable to patients. And but that's why we also have to be equipped to provide these conversations. We have to have decision aids. We have to equip clinicians and patient groups with some of the materials they need to be able to engage in these conversations with patients so that they can come to a rational decision with the best available information about whether or not they should try these therapies while that because there's going to be that higher degree of uncertainty, about the value to the
Hmm.
patient. So, but I mean, we don't want to forego those opportunities either, because a lot of these treatments are going to eventually become standard of care. And we have to be able to demonstrate their efficacy somehow. The real world is probably the best place to do it.
Yeah. And it seems to me like this is also going to be an opportunity for patients to say, well, what are my priorities in my treatment decision making? Do I want to have, an event-free survival, or, like, what are my priorities in this situation?
Absolutely. And we know, for instance, that if you are um, elderly and perhaps somewhat frail, your priorities might be very different. Like as you pointed out, it may be symptom control and very much quality of life, like maintaining mobility and and certain the ability to do certain activities versus, the off chance, versus trying to extend one's life, right? They want to make sure that the later stages of life are highest quality. So there's definitely going to be patients that are going to have different reasons for making different decisions. We as patient groups and also clinician groups and clinicians have to be prepared to understand how those decisions are going to be made and how to assist patients in making those very individual decisions.
Yeah. So, Bob, if we wanted to find out more, where could we go?
Well, there's going to be right now we have a publication that's just gone through peer review. I'm a co-author on this with Dr. Christian Thorland and a number of other authors. I forget the name of the journal right now. It's a health economics journal. I will share that with you so that you can share it with your audience, to watch for that. That's going to be,
Hmm.
I mean, it might be a little bit elevated language from the lay audience, but also on the CanCertainty YouTube channel we did a patient group webinar on this one, so that's available on the CanCertainty YouTube channel. You can link to that as well. For this talk, that would be a very good source to get a better understanding of this emerging policy area. So those would be, I think, the two best areas. Watch for the publication, which will be out very, very soon, and the CanCertainty webinar that's available on YouTube.
So is that what's the channel for the CanCertainty? Is it at CanCertainty?
Yes, that's correct. And I mean,
So
I'll flip it to
CAN
you. I'll
certainty.
flip. I don't have it quite in front of me exactly, but I'll flip it to you separately so you can link it on the notes
Yeah,
that cover
I will
this.
do that. Yeah. So, I mean, maybe just I've got two questions I want to ask you. So maybe just some closing thoughts on this topic. And then I'd like to know, like, what are your, beyond the oncology relevant endpoints, what are your top priorities in cancer policy, cancer advocacy in Canada?
So, well, first of all, I think sort of a larger sort of philosophical thing is it's about health technology assessment in general. Um, Health technology assessment cannot stand still. Technologies for treating disease and treating cancer are constantly evolving. Therefore, the methodologies to assess these new technologies and the way they evolve through clinical trials. HTA has to continually evolve. It can never stand still, and that's, I think, a challenge that we always have as advocates in Canada, is to continue to ensure that we're constantly adapting and moving forward. And that's kind of how this fits in as well. We're
Yeah, that's
just
such an important point too.
yeah, and so I mean, that's why we're in, and and a lot of it's just simply the speed of adaptation too. Like we there are different types of experts that occupy the executive offices of a lot of these health technology assessment agencies. Some are extraordinarily progressive and understand the continually need to adapt and learn new methods of doing this work, and some are kind of a little bit more caught in the past. So we're always struggling with that.
Mm.
Um, then as far as other areas that CanCertainty and myself are very focused on, one of what started CanCertainty was our efforts to improve access to take-home cancer drugs, and that continues to be one of our key advocacy initiatives. That is, so just to describe that issue, take-home cancer drugs that are either administered at home, either subcutaneously through injection or taken by pill in the home setting. Those offer tremendous advantages to both to the healthcare system and to the patient. Yet in Ontario and Atlantic Canada, these drugs are not available to all patients equally. Specifically, patients under the age of 65 in Ontario and Atlantic Canada have significant challenges accessing these treatments without having to pay significant out-of-pocket costs. So that's an area that continues to be one of our focus areas for CanCertainty. That's kind of how we started, and we are continuing to try to level the playing field regarding access to take-home cancer drugs.
And you've done a lot of work in that space too, because it used to be that it didn't matter how old you were, you didn't have access to take-home cancer drugs at all.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's been about 15 years since we've seen the emergence of those technologies, these targeted therapeutics that you can take, at home versus infused drugs in the hospital setting. And that also required, a change back in the day for health technology assessment and reimbursement policy. But unfortunately, reimbursement policy has not kept up in certain provinces. Effectively in the Western provinces, Alberta, BC, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan, effectively all cancer treatments, regardless of how they're administered, are effectively available universally to cancer patients, as it should be. Quebec has, as you're well aware, has its own unique drug program, which is sort of a mandatory insurance approach to reimbursement. It's kind of like the Obamacare model of drug coverage in Canada. And so it's pseudo universal there. I mean, everyone has got affordable access. It's Ontario and the Atlantic provinces that have not kept up their reimbursement policies. They've not adapted their reimbursement policies to these new technologies. Their old reimbursement policies are still caught in the days of you know, cancer being infused, cancer treatments being infused. So you know, that remains a challenge for us, and it's hard work. It's you know, our policymakers are not necessarily paying enough attention to this, and we're trying to change that.
Yeah, I feel like our policymakers are not necessarily paying enough attention to cancer just in general. But I think that that's
I
a
agree.
conversation we could probably go on about for another hour.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time, Bob. I mean, I'm really looking forward to learning as you have more as your publication comes out, as more information is being shared. I'm really looking forward to being more involved and to learning more from you. And thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you for Sabrina for inviting me to participate in this, and I look forward to speaking with you soon.
Yeah, same. Have a good
Bye bye
one.
now.
Bye.